Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name's Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and I'm also the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. Today's topic is how chocolate gets its flavors on, and I updated the title, and I'll tell you why as we get into things. But before we begin, I'd like to remind everybody who may be watching that you can go into the live chat on YouTube or the comments or LinkedIn and Facebook, and you can tell me where in the world you're connecting from geographically. And if you have a comment or you have a question about anything that I might talk about during the course of this hour, put it into today's episode, and I will try to get it asked and answered today. And before I jump into today's topic, which is about flavor and how chocolate gets its flavors, I want to remind everybody that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members of The Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, please go over to the website, become a member. There's always a free tier. And while you're at it, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. And then also give the channel, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for notifications. And with that, I want to get started on today's topic. Saying to everybody, this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life right now. You can go there. This is live. You can go there and follow along with what it is that I'm doing. And for every single episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post on The Chocolate Life dedicated to the topic. And it's where I put resources and other kinds of information, things that I'm going to be talking about during the course of the episode. And you can also find the links to watch the episode after the fact. So just lots of stuff that's going on here. And so with that, what I want to begin is by saying I am putting together this episode in part because I'm giving a talk with my friend and colleague Zoe Papalexandratou at the end of October in Brussels for the British Society of Flavorists. And their annual symposium is all about chocolate and chocolate flavor, obviously, because they're professional flavorists. And I have to create a presentation which comes at the topic of how chocolate gets its flavors, which doesn't come from the perspective of a professional flavorist. And, that's really, really important to me. And so I appreciate everybody who's allowing me, through listening to this and providing feedback, to give me the opportunity to talk through a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. I've got a very short period of time, and I need to speak at like a 10,000 meter or 33,000 foot level to go through it over the course of an hour. And this is helping me get the reps in, get the practice in to talk about it and listen to myself and understand what's going on. So thank you very much for your forbearance and patience. And if you have questions about any of this, please let me know. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go into, taste and flavor. They're used interchangeably. And so if you're at The Chocolate Life, the post for today, there's a little toggle where I talk about the difference between taste and flavor. And it's important. Anybody who's followed me for any length of time know that I think that talking about the way words are used is really, really important to me. So taste and flavor are often used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. So taste is actually refers to the sensations in our mouths. So it is based upon the taste bud receptors in our tongue and elsewhere in our mouth, right? And it is where the five basic tastes of sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami are sensed. So these signals, the taste buds are activated by chemicals in whatever it is they eat. They send signals to a part of our brain, and parts of our brain light up and go, yummy, 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 or they go, yeah, I don't like this so much, right? Flavor, on the other hand, right, is a multisensory experience. It's not only what we taste, but what we smell. It is the physical sensation of, the texture and the mouthfeel. So is it crunchy? Does it melt? All of the things associated with that. There are sensations like astringency, which is not a taste. It's a physical sensation in the mouth. And then how all of those things work together in the context of our experience and memory. And these are also informed by the way something looks and the way something sounds. Right? So as we're eating it, do I get a sound in my mouth? As I'm breaking it, do I get a sound? What does it look like? All of these things are what flavor is. And so it's really important when I say how chocolate gets its taste, that means one thing. And when I say how chocolate gets its flavor, that means something else. And so I'm going to really speak about this more for how chocolate gets its flavors on. So I'm going to be talking about those things particularly. And I'm going to make the first observation that although it may become obvious, or it may be obvious, that all taste is chemical. Everything that we sense on our tongue, right, is based on the interaction of taste chemicals and whatever it is that we're eating, and sensors, taste buds, right, which exist on our tongue and in our mouth and throat. So all taste is chemical, right? And so one of the most important things to know, and I just added these two images this morning, right? So chocolate is extremely chemically complex. It's really, really important to know that. At the moment, the slide says, and I'm reading through this because if you're listening to the audio podcast, you won't be following along. So if you are following along, that's a good thing too. There are over 750 distinct aroma, and that should say taste chemicals. So this is an image that I put together, it's now over a decade ago for a presentation. So there are over 750 distinct aroma and taste chemicals that have been identified. And this was as of over a decade ago. And it's important to know that there is no single chemical that has yet been discovered, right, which is responsible for the typical aroma of the typical smell of cocoa and the taste of cocoa. Again, I need to think about the language and be more consistent. I am just as bad as most people are about not separating out and distinguishing about when I mean taste and when I mean flavor. So I'm going to go update this slide to do that. I didn't think about it because this whole thing came to me this morning as I was preparing for this this live stream today. So while there are over 750 distinct compounds that have been identified in cocoa, there is no single chemical that we can look at and say, this is cocoa or this is chocolate. It turns out there are about 25 chemicals are needed for typical cocoa aroma and about 50 needed for typical cocoa taste. So just this, it's really, really important to understand that chocolate is chemically extremely complex, right? And that all taste is chemical. So the next slide is interesting to me because it's based on the work of Professor Peter Schieberle. This is a bit of research that I first ran across in 2011, 2012, and it became a part of this presentation that I just like the Experimental Cuisine Collective in New York City. There was a one-day symposium at ICE, the Institute for Culinary Education. Michael Iskonis, who runs the chocolate lab there, put this together. But what Peter Schieberle and his group discovered, right, back in 2011, is that when you want to put chocolate flavor together, right, what you can do is rather than breaking it down into individual chemical compounds, you can break it down into more complex groupings and give them names associated with foods. And so chocolate flavor might contain a flavor that we think of as potato chips, and it could contain a flavor of cooked meat. Peaches, add some fruitiness to it. A raw beef fat, cooked cabbage, human sweat, a cucumber. So we can think about chocolate flavor in not just in terms of the individual actual chemical components, right? We can think about it in terms of more complex groupings of flavors or chemicals that we can identify as individual flavors, right? And so, you might think of as human sweat, what is that all about? But if you've ever been and smelled a fermentation box, like at the 5th or 6th day in after 1 or 2 turns, and then you've walked through the New York City subway system in the middle of summer and walked past some, unfortunately there's a homeless, unhoused problem in New York City. And so often they will spend a good deal of their time in the subway system. You'll walk past a group of people and you'll go, man, that reminds me of a cocoa fermentation pile. I mean, this has happened to me many, many times. And so you look at these and you go, that seems really, really weird, right? How does that happen? But we can think of the flavor of chocolate in terms of not just the individual chemicals which compose it, but these higher level flavor groupings. And we do that. We say that, something reminds me of red fruit or something is a honeyed flavor, right? We might think of a vegetal sweetness as opposed to a fruity sweetness. And these provide, there's often an earthiness, and we might go from earthiness into something like mushroom or earthiness into, something bark, for example. These are the ways we think about things at a higher level. We don't think of these things in terms of the individual chemical components. We use higher level language. And the thing that occurred to me, and again, this is I'm out and about early in the morning. I'm doing my morning walk, and I'm running through what it is that I'm going to speak during the day, and trying to put together a run of show script and highlight the topics that I want to talk about. And it occurred to me that I think one of the most important things that we talk about, or the ways to think about how chocolate gets its flavor on, is that there are going to be two approaches. Right? And it is this realization that there are two approaches, which is what is going to inform my presentation to the British Society of Flavorists. So I've done it. So the first approach is analytical, right? And what we're trying to do in an analytical approach is to deconstruct the flavor of chocolate. So we're going to take a chocolate, we're going to subject it to analytical chemical analysis. So we're going to put it into some sort of GCMS, some device to go and say, here are the chemicals which are in this particular product, whether that product is a chocolate or whether it's a cocoa. What we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out what the chemical structure is. And then what we can do is we can work backwards from this upstream. So we can say, here is our understanding of the chemistry of a chocolate. We can work back, and we can then say, oh, this is the chemistry of the cocoa bean which was used to make this chocolate. And we can come up with this sort of chemical understanding. And we have the components of, for at this point, taste, right? And again, I wrote this morning, and I'm working backward around this idea around taste and flavor, and I'm inconsistent in my usage, right? And so talking about it does help me. So because at this point, while we understand what the chemical components are which contribute to our taste perception of a chocolate, it turns out, as we learned in last Friday's episode, that the fat component and the way the fat melts in the chocolate that we're eating contributes to our perception of flavor. So while we have an analytical understanding of what the chemistry is of the chocolate, and an analytical understanding of what the chemistry of the cocoa is, and we can characterize things like, what is the fat melting curve, right? So how does either a single fat like cocoa butter, two cocoa butters with different melting points which are mixed together, the cocoa butter which does and doesn't have an emulsifier like lecithin or PGPR, maybe there's another fat entirely. So we have some sort of palm kernel fraction or coconut oil or some other fat that we're using that changes the perception of the chemicals because of the differences in the way the fat melts. So we can characterize these things chemically, all of these things. We can characterize in terms of the physics of it and the chemistry of it, right? What we can't get to is the individual memory/experience components. So I'm bringing to my perception of an individual chocolate product or whatever it is that I'm eating. I have these ideas which are based on what the food culture that I grew up in, the specific chocolates that I grew up with as a child that inform my flavor, inform my preferences as an adult. Right. So we can have this analytical understanding, and what that might be really good at, what that might be really useful for, and I think it is really useful for, is that if what it is that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a product that is perfectly consistent. So from manufacturing run to manufacturing run, and I would say that this is one of the highlights of what it means to be an industrial maker, is that consistency is a requirement because your customers are demanding it. And what you do is you start out with the end goal in mind. And throughout the entire process, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to replicate something that already exists because my customers demand that this already exists. And so it makes sense if I can deconstruct the aroma profile, if I can deconstruct the taste profile, if I can deconstruct and understand the physics of how the fat melts, what I can do is I can create something, number one, which is a one-to-one analog. It faithfully represents, it will faithfully construct this existing target that I'm looking for. And I think that is, I don't think that this is one of the things that I understand goes on when it comes to any kind of industrial food production. Right? And so if I am a flavorist and I'm sitting in a flavor lab, right, for the most part, I need to balance how does my analytical understanding of the chemistry of what it is that I'm doing, right? That actually ends up having to be proved out by a tasting panel, that there need to be perhaps both trained tasters and untrained tasters who are going to pass judgment on, do I like, what are the things about this that I like? What are the things that I don't like about what it is that I'm tasting right now? Right? So the analytical understanding will only get us so far. And what I can do is I may say that, I have two chemicals, right? Two flavoring chemicals that I'm going to add to a product, and I can change the balance between them. So I might up one and get a more green, fresh note. I could reduce that and up another and get more a cooked, browned note, right? And so it all depends on what it is that I am looking to deliver as an experience to the person who is ultimately going to eat the product, or the person who's going to take the product and then use it as an ingredient in another product. So this is where the analytical approach is useful. It's helpful, right? But it's important to understand that I think that what we're doing is we're trying to deconstruct taste and flavor and aroma at that point, because I can have aroma chemicals which work in the nose, but which may not work in the tongue. So we need to consider that. But I am deconstructing these elements of what it is that I'm consuming. And then the approach, which I think I want to spend more time on, right? And I've already spent 20 minutes getting to this point. But the point that I want to talk about, which I think most professional flavorists may not be aware of, is what I call the process approach, right? And so the process approach is about constructing flavor and about constructing aroma and constructing experience by going as far back as we can down the production chain. So in this particular case, if we can think about the process of constructing flavor, right, then what we need to do is we need to start at cocoa, the cacao tree. And the single most important thing to understand when we go back to the beginning is that the entire process is like really fungible and really variable. There are lots of variable when it comes to producing a dried cocoa bean. So people tend to think genetics is really important. That is true. Genetics represents flavor potential to some point, to some extent, but that flavor potential is then modified by a whole bunch of factors. So I have a particular genetics and they grow in, up in the mountains as opposed to up in the plains. There's different chemical composition of the soil. Those might have an impact on what the final flavor potential of the dried bean is. So genetics represents potential, and that potential is modified by, among other things, all of the agronomic processes. And so those agronomic processes include things like terroir, the things we normally think of as terroir, the chemical composition of soil, how much rain, how much sun, when in the day we get the sun, when in the year we get the rain, what the daytime temperatures are, what the nighttime temperatures are. All of those things contribute to an expression of the potential of the tree. And then there are the agricultural practices, which include, are the trees healthy? So am I fertilizing it properly? Am I pruning it properly? And then all of that is complicated by what tree is donating the pollen for the pod. So the parent tree represents, right, one aspect of the potential, but that potential is also modified by the genetics of the tree that provided the pollen for the flower that eventually grows into a pod. And so if I am a tree that is self-compatible, maybe the pollen is coming from a flower on the same tree. If I'm growing in a farm and there are 3 or 4 or 5 different varieties within, a kilometer or so, kilometer or so, then it turns out that the pollen may come from another tree with different parent genetics. And so what's sitting inside that pod may be a naturally occurring hybrid. And in that respect, cocoa is a lot like an apple tree. If you were to go to an apple tree, even a cultivated apple tree, let's take a Granny Smith, you open up the tree, you pull out the seeds, you plant the seeds. The trees that grow, you have no idea what they're going to look like. Right? There's no predictable correlation in planting the seeds from an apple tree and what you'll get, right? And the same thing is true when it comes to cocoa. You don't know what pollinated the flower, and so you can't predict, right? Well, unless you hand pollinate and you can guarantee that nothing else pollinated a flower, then you can't predict what it is that's going on. So, if I take 20 pods from the same tree, will they have identical genetics? Maybe not. Right? And this is a long explanation. I'm talking it all through, but the genetic potential of the tree is expressed through just all of the local conditions, right? That have to do with before the pod is harvested, right? Is a very, very complex set of interrelated variables. All right, and as they say, the results are entirely fungible. What you're going to get from harvest to harvest to harvest is going to change, even from the same tree. So it's important to understand that. So all of that stuff, right, gets filtered through the post-harvest processing practices, and these include things like a preconditioning process before fermentation. So maybe what I do is I take the pods off the tree and I move them out of the farm to a central collection area, but I don't open the pods for 24 to 72 hours for one reason or another. I want whatever is inside the pod to reduce in moisture and concentrate in sugar. And so that's a precondition, sometimes called pre-drying, which it's not. It does make the pulp a little less wet, so it does dry in some respect, but preconditioning is a better term. And preconditioning is not something that is practiced universally. So it is an option as part of the post-harvest processing practices. And then there is fermentation. And fermentation is just the Wild West, even when we tightly control the conditions. So I can control many of the variables. I can instrument the pile. I can look very, very closely at what the temperature is. I can look at changes in pH over time. There are changes in sugar level. There are many things that I can measure during the course of fermentation, and I can make decisions based on, okay, when the pile reaches this temperature and when it reaches this pH, what I'm going to do is that's an indication that I want to turn, right? And so there is this analytical chemical approach to fermentation, right? Which informs, in which what you try to do is you try to control as many variables as you possibly can to develop a protocol for steering the potential flavor when you convert the bean into chocolate. So that is one approach. The vast majority of cocoa in the world that is harvested is either unfermented or if it is fermented in a way that I would call sort of based on, abuelito, abuelito practices. This is the way my grandfather did it, so I'm doing it this way. My grandfather's grandfather did it this way, and so I'm going to do it that way. So it's 3 days, or it's 4 days, or it's 7 days, and we're going to turn every 24 hours. It's just, there is no analytical understanding. It comes from an experience, right? But when we take a look at all of those variables, what we understand is that the flavor potential in the beans, which is the final chemical in the dried beans, and oh, by the way, drying does have an influence on the final chemical composition of the cotyledon, the bean, right? So all of these things are going to contribute to the particular flavor potential, right? When we take the bean and transform it into chocolate. And one of the reasons why that's important is that very few people consume either raw cocoa nib or roasted cocoa nib. We consume chocolate. So there are at least one or two extra transformation steps between the dried bean, or roasted, unroasted, and what it is that we are eating. And so we have this multi-step process. So I have the on-farm processes, which are related genetics, which are related to post-harvest processing, the agronomic processes, right? Each one of these steps from the tree, right, is modifying the potential of what the genetics are capable of producing, right? And as I say, there's a lot of research that has been done into fermentation. And my colleague Zoe Papalexandratou, who's going to be presenting with me, has a PhD in cocoa fermentation and has been responsible for much of the steering protocols for Ingemin in Nicaragua. And one of the things that they did, which is really quite fascinating, is they have a single variety, the Chuno variety, and they can deliver at least 5 different flavor profiles from the same genetics, right, based on controlling the variables of fermentation and drying. So depending on how long, the number of days they ferment, when the first turn is, how many turns there are, right, how many days there are in drying, what they can do is they can deliver beans which have radically different flavors. And so what I will do is I will put a link to the page, and you can, for the Chuno flavor varieties, and you can get an idea of just how different you can have a chocolate which is made from beans of the same genetics, right, which are grown all over Nicaragua. So they're grown in different soils, different parts of the country, and the kinds of flavors that you deliver consistently, right? The whole process is very, very fungible. And you may remember that a little while ago we had an interview on PodSafe Chocolate with a researcher by the name of Bertus Eskis. And he is the inventor of a couple of interesting fermentation protocols. And these 4 fermentation protocols go against, I would say, 99% of all the conventional and received wisdom, which is associated with how to ferment and how to ferment properly, and what you can do in the fermentation to drive flavors in a particular way. And so our understanding of what happens is still not completely understood, and there's a lot of work that can be done. And it's also important just to keep in mind that the vast majority of the chocolate industry is based around the flavors of bulk and commodity cocoa, right? That they're interested in a sort of a plain, clear cocoa flavor. Ghana is the reference flavor when it comes to cocoa. So when we think of Ghanaian cocoa, and one of the things that Ghana has done extremely well is they've been able to produce a very, very consistent product, so that you can pick up the phone in Switzerland and call a broker and say, I want, 500 tons of Ghana, and, except for a cut test, which will determine, whether or not, things like, is the distribution of fermentation what I'm expecting in order to make a particular recipe? Is there physical damage? So is there mold or mildew or insect damage? Right? I just, with confidence, I can pick up the phone and order sight unseen, right, what it is that I'm looking for, and be reasonably reasonably confident that what I can do is I can take this cocoa and make a chocolate I already know how to make. That is the way the commodity cocoa industry, the industrial chocolate industry is put together. That is the goal. That is the objective. For the most part, they're not interested in the flavors that people in the specialty cocoa and specialty chocolate world, cacao fino, would say, as you know, they're not interested necessarily in fruit. They're not interested in flowers. They're not interested necessarily in spice as part of what they're doing, because most of their customers, number one, are looking for products that have a lot of sugar and dairy in them. Most of their customers are, or the chocolate is a component in something else. And so as we think about, flavors and things like that, we also need to be very, very careful about what the industry is looking for. The specialty chocolate world, what we think of as craft chocolate, is maybe 2% of the market. It's supposed to be 180 billion, there or less. If it's a $3 billion market, in small producers, that would be optimistic in terms of global sales. So we need to be very, very careful in thinking about how we think about how chocolate gets its flavors on. And so for me, this has been, the interesting aspect of this, which is how do I go about and talk to an audience of professional flavorists, right? And one of the flavorists is this guy, Peter Schieberle, right, whose research I ran across 13, 14 years ago, who really started me down this path and really made me interested in thinking about this idea of, okay, how do we go about describing the flavor of something? How do we go about describing the taste of something? How do we describe what it is that we're smelling, right? And that what I know, right, which is based on working from the farm through the factory to the consumer, how that is going to be different from working from a flavor lab in a big company. And how do you go about bridging the two different worlds? And the original title for the talk that I always give was quantifying the flavors of cocoa and chocolate. And then after looking at who the other presenters were going to be, right, I realized, well, maybe there's an opportunity here to get the people who are going to be in the presentation, who are participating on that day, to think about, right, chocolate as a food and chocolate as an ingredient in a slightly different way, to give them a more comprehensive understanding of what happens to chocolate, right? What happens to cocoa, number one, on the farm, and number two, how that cocoa is transformed in manufacturing. And we haven't even, began to touch how roasting has an influence, how I refine and how I conch, how all of those things have an influence, what particle size is, how the recipe, affects the finished flavor perception we have in a chocolate. And what I want to know, for those who are watching who care to comment, is how much of this is interesting to you? If you're a chocolate maker, are these things you think about consciously, right? Or are they sort of intuitive? What is the process of saying, here's what I'm tasting in a cocoa bean, and here's what I imagine the chocolate might be? How do I get from this sort of, chances are you're not doing, if you're doing any analysis, it's, are there any mold and mildew spores I need to worry about that might grow in my chocolate after I make it? Am I worried about heavy metal analysis? I'm doing a chemical analysis. It's not around any kind of, understanding the chemistry of the cocoa bean or the chemistry of the chocolate that I'm making. I may be doing it from a food safety perspective, which is a very different perspective altogether. But, how much of this, again, is something that you think about? I mean, if you are in the world of flavor, right, and you're working in a lab in new product development or of confectionery products, for consumers, or if you're working in a lab that develops new flavoring compounds, so that I want to develop a new chocolate flavor because a customer is coming to me and they're making a product and they want to deliver a specific chocolate flavor profile. Maybe there's no chocolate in the product, maybe there's no cocoa in the product, but I want to deliver a chocolate flavor. Or these things are very, very different. And I think that it's understanding, I think for me, not assuming that I know who the people in the audience are and what they're coming from, and asking myself all of these questions and moving forward as I move forward in the presentation. And fortunately, Zoe and our presentation is going to be the last presentation during the course of the day. And so I have a chance to listen to what everybody else is talking about, and then modifying what it is that I'm going to say when I put the slides up on the screen. So for the presentation, I get a chance to modify what it is that I'm saying based on what everybody else is doing. And then, how much do I want to get into, this is the current state of our understanding of genetics, or this is our understanding of, fermentation protocols, and this is our understanding of the X and the Y and Z, right? Does it make sense to go and think, okay, we have these two general approaches to thinking about flavor. One is deconstructing and one is constructing, right? And as a professional flavorist, you may be thinking primarily from the point of deconstruction. So here is something, what are the chemical components go into this particular flavor, because I want to replicate that flavor, right? Again and again in an industrial process, or I want to create some sort of additive that I can use, which has that flavor. So, or it is what it is, and if I come at it from, here is the constructive approach. So here are the building blocks that go into delivering chocolate flavor. Does that make more sense for this audience? And from what I understand, right? And I'm talking this through, and thank you very much, everybody, for your forbearance here. What I'm learning is that the most professional flavorists don't have a real considered understanding of actually how chocolate gets its flavor. From a process perspective, they understand that yes, cocoa beans are an ingredient. They understand that there are different genetics deliver different flavor potential. They may know that there are 3 different genetics, so Criollo, Forastero, and Trinitario, which is a pre-2008 understanding of what's going on. They may know a little bit about fermentation, but might not know just how much fermentation has an impact on the flavor of the chocolate that they produce. And so focusing on it that way, how chocolate gets its flavors on, rather than quantifying the flavors of cocoa and chocolate is where I think I'm leaning towards in terms of title for this presentation. But is it interesting to you? That's what it is that I want to know. Because eventually what I hope to do is I hope to work with the British Society of Flavorists and turn this presentation, which is I've got 30 minutes plus time for questioning, right? Can I turn this presentation into a multi-part series, right, which focuses on this? So number one is there's an extensive webinar and supporting materials which just talk about cocoa. And then there's a second part which talks about the transformation of cocoa into chocolate, right? And then there's the third part, which is the analytical chemistry component, right? Would that be of interest to you if these materials were originally available first to professional flavorists, right? And then were available to you as a chocolate maker? Would they be interesting to you? I have no idea what that looks like right now, and I'm speaking, and I have no idea if the British Society of Flavorists is going to say yes, let's go do this. And I'm raising the idea of doing something like that. But the goal is for me, is to provide this much more complete understanding of what goes on. It's interesting to me as a professional communicator in and around chocolate, going and having this conversation. It informs how I talk about flavor and taste and cocoa and chocolate. And I found it, as I say, I found it incredibly useful to me. But I'd like to know what you know. What is the biggest question you've got about how chocolate gets its flavors on? Right? The one thing that has, so in this whole discussion, right, this whole exploration of getting ready for this particular presentation, one of the things that has, truly, I think surprised me is not the right word, right? But has sort of fundamentally changed my understanding of things, is just how much we don't know about the possibility of fermentation, right? And what fermentation can deliver. We think that there are right ways and there are wrong ways to ferment. And I don't know anymore that I can make that categorization very, very cleanly. Certainly, I love the idea of highly technified fermentation. So what we're doing is we're developing protocols where we can say, by observing changes of the chemistry of the bean during fermentation and drying, what we can do is we can say, this bean will deliver this chocolate flavor consistently, and this bean fermented and dried differently will deliver an entirely different flavor, right? Consistently. That is really, really intriguing to me, but it represents a very, very small amount of the fermentation that is being done in cocoa globally. So what happens when we don't ferment, right? We think about, not fermenting cocoa, and we say it's not going to deliver any nuance. It's not going to, and, maybe that's not true anymore. So one of the things which is going to be really interesting for me is there's a company in Cote d'Ivoire called Cocoa Ions, and they're going to be sending me samples of 3 fermentations, 3 chocolates, which are the result of fermentations which have been developed by Bertus Esquis. And these products are going to be available commercially in early 2025. And so what we do is we find from an Amelinado forastero, that's the primary genetics that are grown in that part of the world. What we find is that the Amelinado forastero is capable of delivering some surprisingly interesting flavor, right, in chocolate, depending upon the way we ferment it or don't, right? And so I am going to be walking into this presentation. I'm going to be tasting these 3 chocolates that I have maybe tasted the day before for the first time, right? And am building sort of an entire presentation around this notion. Because what I want to do is I want to impress on the people who are there that just how fungible the process of on the farm is before you get to thinking about all of the manufacturing processes, right? And with that, I'm sort of I've talked through all of the things that I want to talk through today. I've got 1 or 2 things I want to add to the post on the Chocolate Life for this episode of Pod Safe Chocolate. What I want to do is make one quick note, is that last Friday, the episode was on being more-ish, pursuing the bliss point. And Mark Joyce of Blue Spruce Chocolates in Kittredge, Colorado, asked a couple of questions about cocoa butter, because I went on about cocoa butter and how the melting point of cocoa butter will affect how flavor is released. And in the comments to last Friday's live stream, so in the comments to Pursuing the Bliss Point on being Moorish, Pursuing the Bliss Point, there are 2 comments, right, that I have added to this because I told Mark that I would do the research. And the first post is sort of the first comment is sort of a high level understanding about what influences, what technical factors influence the melting point of a cocoa butter. They include things like the fatty acid composition, the triglyceride structure, so the triacylglycerol structure is a better way of thinking about it, and the growing conditions. So you can have the same genetics growing in different parts of the world, and you will end up with a fatty acid composition and the structure, which will lead to a different melting point, right? And so there is, however, I found a sort of high level, right, differentiation that says that West African cocoa butter, right, tends to have a higher melting point. That Southeast Asian cocoa butter is similar, but it also sometimes is higher and sometimes is lower, depending on what you're going. And then South American cocoa butter tends to melt out at a lower starting temperature. And so one of the things that happens when you take, if you're primarily working with a South American cocoa butter, so if I'm buying beans from Peru and I can't get Peruvian cocoa butter, I might be able to get Ecuadorian cocoa butter, and it will melt about the same way, right? But when I take two different complex chemicals, cocoa butter, complex product, and they have different fatty acid compositions, and the structure of the triacylglycerol is different, and I put them together, right? What I'm doing is I'm annealing them, right? When I cool them, when I temper them, and the crystal structure that forms is different from either of the two parent cocoa butters. And that annealing process, it's sort of like taking, two different metals. So what is it? Tin and copper, and making bronze or brass. I forget which one it is. So it turns out that the final metal has very, very different structural characteristics than either of the two metals which form the basis of the alloy. And so I think that it is, for example, taking a Southeast Asian cocoa butter, which is a higher melting point, and adding it to a cocoa butter from beans which might come from Ecuador, right, which might have a low cocoa. What you end up is with a fat that doesn't have the melting point of either of the two parents, right? And that might be where some of it's waxy when you bite on it comes from, right? That waxiness is a higher melting point. You're biting through it, right? And it doesn't melt in a typical kind of way. Anyway, so here are some things that I did research on cocoa butter, and then, right, there's the reply to that comment that I made is a little bit more detail about how each of these things, differences might be influenced, right, by local growing conditions. So is the climate overall warmer or cooler? Is the difference between daytime high and nighttime low? How does it contribute to things? And then soil conditions. So what's going on in the soil that might have a contributing factor to what the melting point of the cocoa butter is. And so I just wanted to point out that, I do take the questions that are asked during each episode. I take them seriously. And when I do reply, I will reply in the comments to the post. And that's one of the reasons to become a member of The Chocolate Life. If you are a member of The Chocolate Life, if you become a premium member, every single time there is an update. So every single new post, you'll get a notification that, hey, new post, and you'll actually get the text of the post emailed to you, as well as images if they're included. But free members will receive the monthly newsletter. And there are some member-only, there's some members-only content that you can go to. And so this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by the members. And you can go to the website. There's a little button up here. I'm logged in, so it says account. But if you're not logged in, or if you're not logged in, you click on the sign in button. But if you're not a member, you click join. There's always a free membership level if you can support what it is that I do financially. I'm not doing Patreon or anything else in terms of looking for income sources to support the work that I'm doing in The Chocolate Life and Pod Save Chocolate. And so I ask you for your support in that way. You will notice sometime starting in the next couple of weeks, I hope, is that I have added an advertising position up at the top of the page. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using it to promote, excuse me, festivals. And so I'll put advertising up there. You'll be able to link to the buy tickets page, to get more information page, and things like that. But I will be having an advertising rotation position, which is specifically about promoting festivals. So please don't be surprised when you come and see it. And if you get the member newsletter, you will be updated in the member newsletter about that. The one other thing I want to say before I call today an end to today is to point out that I have started uploading episodes of PodSafe Chocolate as audio-only podcasts. And so what you can do is up in the top navigation where it says PodSafe Choc, right? If you click on the down arrow, one of the options is to go and look at the audio podcast dashboard. And so if you're watching now, I'm showing the dashboard page on a website called Pinecast. So I'm using Pinecast to host all the audio content. What you see is you see links to desktop applications you might use if you want to listen to the podcast episodes on your desktop. And then there are also a bunch of mobile applications that you can use. So if, for example, you're a Spotify user, you can go and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, and you can just follow along all the episodes on Spotify or Apple Music or some other podcast platform, whichever one you'd like. So there's also an RSS feed. So if you'd like to subscribe to the RSS feed and some other application which is not directly supported, you'll be able to do that at the moment. You'll be able to do that right now. Just go and visit and click on the link, and you can figure things out. As I said, at the moment, of the 75, this is the 76th episode, 40 of them have been uploaded to Pinecast and are available to listen right now. So that's something well over 40 hours of audio content that you can listen to. I may upload some episodes of the Chocolate Life Live. Not entirely sure yet, but I want to get through all the episodes of PodSafe Chocolate first. Once I get to the backlog and making sure that everything is uploaded from that, what I will be doing is I'll be working on uploading new episodes within 48 to 72 hours of when the episode went live. It turns out it's a multi-step process of downloading the video, then stripping the audio from the video. Then I edit out the roughly 49, 50-second intro music. So every episode starts with hello, which is the way I open up the episodes these days. And then I need to export it and then get it compressed into a format which is appropriate or transcode it into a format which is appropriate for audio podcasting. So all of those things take some time, and I finally figured out a workflow for doing it. So it's all good. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody who's followed me along today from the beginning, or you jumped in the middle. Again, you can go to the page for this episode of PodSafe Chocolate on TheChocolateLife.com, and you can go and read my show notes and look at the images that I embedded into the post, and then follow along on any comments which might be added afterwards. However, you don't need to be a member to do any of those things. You do, however, need to be a member if what you want to do is you want to ask a question in the comments on any particular page, right? And so with that, I want to say two final things. So a week from today, we're going to do another preview episode for the Salon du Chocolat in New York City. This one is aimed more on what can members of the general public expect, as opposed to what's being done for exhibitors, right? So I think that might be interesting. We'll be joined by organizing staff from the Salon du Chocolat, so people from the Messe of Frankfurt. And then I also hope to have a number of guests who are going to be talking about the educational stuff and all the other special programs they're going to be put together for the salon this year. And then 2 weeks from today, the 15th of October, Happy 1st of October, everybody. The 15th of October, I have an interview with Rowan Jacobson. So Rowan is a colleague of mine. I first met him in 2008 when we were both finalists in the International Association of Culinary Professional Book Awards. His book on the geography of the American oyster and my book, Discover Chocolate, were both finalists that year. And he's written a new book called Wild Chocolate, Across the Americas in Search of Cacao Soul. So Rowan and I are going to be, that book is actually released a week from today, so on the 8th of October, and I'm going to be interviewing Rowan the following week. He's been a guest here before, and so I'm, he's a fascinating fellow, and I'm really looking forward to him being a guest again back here on Pod Save Chocolate. And signing off as I do, just with a quick reminder, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody,